Hello, everybody. My name is Matthew Remski, and I'm the host of the AntifascistDad podcast, available on all podcast apps. This video is of my full conversation with Father David Inczauskis. I premiered this in episode 7. He is a Jesuit priest and liberation theologian who's been very active and visible in the anti-ICE resistance in Chicago. And what he's done in coordination with his fellow Catholics is he has tried to employ the ritual and symbolic strategy of attempting to bring communion bread to detainees. And of course, he and his comrades have been turned away by the Illinois State Police.
Saying that no human is illegal, hundreds of Catholic priests, nuns, and lay people led a march from a Catholic church in Maywood to the ICE Detention Center in Broadview.
We came out in great strength in numbers today. Catholics from all around Chicagoland.
Now, I was brought up Catholic, and bringing the ritual bread and wine to prisoners is a story, it's a practice that I know goes way back to the story of the very young Saint Tarcisius, who was murdered by a mob of Roman youth for attempting to deliver communion to imprisoned Christians. Now, these days I would describe myself as too leftist to still be a churchgoer, but I am very curious about the direction that Pope Francis and now Pope Leo are taking the church. And in that light, I think I have some idea of the complexity of what this protest performance or this protest ritual actually signifies. What they are doing is they are taking the church to the place of struggle. The church is not a building in this sense or an altar. It is acts of love and service. They are also connecting the body of Jesus to the bodies of the incarcerated and to their own bodies. And David and his comrades are using this symbol of metaphysical transformation to make a direct materialist intervention. So they're not just carrying the communion, across the fence or into the detention facility, ultimately, if they're allowed to do so. They are embodying what the communion is and the life it represents, but also the death as well, because there's a chance they will be shot. So David and his comrades, women and men in religious orders, are taking a stand, and in this they join a long lineage of American religious who have stood up to fascism for over a century. Now, there is a difference, however, today, because in the past, in addition to at times shamefully appeasing or even backing fascist regimes, the broader Catholic Church has often undermined its justice-oriented clergy, or at best offered arm's-length tolerance of their activism. And ground zero for this conflict in the 20th century has been the vitality and the status of liberation theology in Latin America through figures like the Peruvian priest Gustavo Gutierrez, who was kept on a tight leash by church elites because liberation theology makes use of some controversial stuff. It uses a Marxist analysis of capitalism to start. Liberation theology basically says that God speaks through the poor, that there is no difference between serving the poor or the sick or the incarcerated or the migrant or the unhoused person and serving God. These are all the same activities. Now, this was not an unknown theology in 20th century Catholicism or even at the end of the 19th century, but it became liberation theology's bottom line. And they often did that by focusing on the figure of Jesus himself, the unhoused migrant status of Jesus himself. Now, for more on this and all of the background here, you can listen to the audio version of this interview. You just search for Antifascist Podcast on your favorite pod player, and the episode will come up for you, and then you'll see you'll get a fuller description of this context. So now, this priest, Robert Prevost, who has now become Leo XIV, originally of Chicago, just like David, but with decades of service in Gutierrez's home country of Peru, is out there at this moment quoting liberation theology with his full chest in a document that speaks indirectly but also pointedly at Trumpian fascism and the capitalist system that produced him. This is his first major letter to the world's 1.8 billion Catholics. It's called De Lexite, or On the Love of the Poor. And in this letter, Leo spends about 20% of his time directly quoting and elaborating on liberation theology. And this is a direct strike at capitalism itself with phrases like the dictatorship of an economy that kills. And he also condemns ideologies that, quote, defend the absolute autonomy of the marketplace and financial speculation, and that, quote, reject the right of states charged with vigilance for the common good to exercise any form of control. So the link to De Lexite will be in the show notes or in the description here. Now, if that's not a direct enough attack on Trumpian politics, Leo also lays into the abject cruelty of anti-immigrant politics, saying that the church knows of or should know that it is Christ himself who knocks at the door of the community as a migrant. So why did I zoom out so far into all this church history and, background on liberation theology? What does this have to do with bringing communion to an ICE facility in 2025? And the reason is that David Inczauskis is one of the most visible millennial proponents of liberation theology in the U.S., with a social media presence and an excellent podcast about liberation theology. Like Pope Leo, David spent formative years in South America, bearing witness to the destructive nature of U.S.-led global capitalism. So, that imperial boomerang idea where fascism is seen as the blowback of colonialism onto European populations? Well, with liberation theology, I think there's another boomerang in play, which is European Marxism finding an organic expression in Latin America and then spinning back to Chicago and even to Rome itself to build a moral and political case against global cruelty. So we're going to see how it plays out, but I wouldn't be surprised if this Catholicism presents a real problem for Trump. Here's my conversation with Father David Inczauskis. Father David Inczauskis, welcome to Antifascistdad podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Matthew.
Thank you for being here. So this podcast is usually about caregiving in a time of fascism from a familial angle. I'm wondering if we can dub you Anti-Fascist Father for this interview and just start with understanding your vocation a little bit and how it is similar and dissimilar from the family life that a lot of us know. So is Anti-Fascist Father okay for today?
I certainly am an anti-fascist. I am against fascism, and I also am a Catholic priest. So I think that those two together make sense to me.
Okay, so just some basic details for those who might be unfamiliar with the vocation. Straight up, do you own anything?
Complicated question. I would say yes and no. So I do have a private bank account that's in my name. At the same time, any money that I would earn, for example, when I was a professor at Xavier University, that money would go into a community account, and then I would fill out a budget request that I would send to my superior, who would also be attached to the account, and then that money would be deposited into my account. I do, right now I'm recording from my room in the Jesuit community at Ignatius House, so I do have my own bedroom as well as my own bathroom, which is great, but we do share a common kitchen, common living areas, and it is extraordinary in a sense that I do live in a house with 25 other people. So I do have that private bank account. At the same time, any money that would go in there is filtered through the superior, and that's part of our vow of poverty, in fact, would be to have it done in that way. And any money that I receive, I don't directly receive, but it goes to the community as a whole.
Well, speaking of living circumstances, my next question was, given the fact that you do not have a family life, as a lot of people do you get lonely?
Oh, I think I do get lonely. Maybe I wouldn't say that I get especially lonely in the sense that I think, as you point out, Matthew, we're living in a time of great isolation, and isolation is one of the preconditions, I think, that gives rise to fascism. And people crave community life. I think we're social, political beings, and part of our way of establishing meaning in this world is through community. So I consider, in fact, the fact that I do get to live in a community with 25 other guys. We have Mass every day, we have a social, we have dinner together every day for about 45 minutes to an hour every day I'm sitting at a table with 4 or 5 of my Jesuit brothers. That is kind of extraordinary.
Yeah.
in an era that is so defined by individualism, and also that's defined by loneliness. So, I think as a human being, I do get lonely, and that's part of our experience, but I'm so grateful that I live in a community life. And I think maybe that's part of the Jesuit vocation and the priestly vocation that maybe some people don't consider, would be, at least in the Jesuits, our way of living out the priesthood is not living in the little home next to the church where you live by yourself. But in the case of the Jesuits, we really place a strong emphasis on community life, and I feel blessed in that way.
Yeah, and I think that, maybe it means that Jesuit community life is like prefigurative of a kind of anti-fascist social organization. If you're saying that, it reduces isolation, it's going to provide some kind of bulwark against that.
I think that's right. And the other part of it would be that it's an intergenerational community. And so, last year I was the youngest guy in the community. This year there's 2 guys who have arrived who are even younger than I am, which is great, but it spans all the way, up to priests who are in their 80s and 90s. So this is also a huge blessing, I think, in a time where there's these intergenerational gaps. I feel that it's also a huge blessing to be able to live with the wisdom of people, who have much more life experience than I do. But then also, I think, the youth offers a fresh perspective as well. And so we learn a lot from each other, and we have that kind of solidarity across generations, which I think is pretty rare today.
Well, it certainly aids in cultural memory. Like, how do we address these particular problems, and how are we going to go forward? And that's amazing. But with regard to life experiences, I just want to confess that my dad used to grumble a little bit about priests who were like out of touch with family life. And, if they would give sermons about things that should happen domestically or things like that, he would say things like, well, they need to change a diaper or 2 before giving any advice or counsel. And I'm wondering if you have to do some kind of, domestic research or community research to keep you grounded in the larger needs of the Catholic family.
Yeah, great question. Well, I would have to admit, I think that for me to give advice to parents about parenting does not really compute for me. Yes, I do have no life experience in that area. At the same time, I do have a family. Actually, I was adopted, and I was adopted at birth, and I have my siblings and that family experience. Now, my 2 siblings are also younger than me, and neither of them have children, though I'd be happy to the degree that it makes sense in our situation, for me to accompany them as well as an uncle to any nieces or nephews who may be on the way, of course. But then I think part of it is also the importance of simply having friends.
Right.
Because it's true, and to the degree that I isolate myself in this community, then I'm not going to have that experience. But the degree to which a Jesuit might proceed in a more pastoral fashion to have friends who are outside of the Society of Jesus, lay women and men who do open the doors to their family life. This was one of my great experiences when I was in France, is I worked for this group that was doing social entrepreneurship. So it's projects that are innovative but are also dedicated to the common good. So not thinking about, enterprising for the sake of private gain, as is often the case, but for the sake of addressing some kind of community need. And the director of this organization, Pauline, had me over for family vacations, also for meals in her house. I got to know her children, and I feel like that is so important. Maybe I feel like I don't think of it as research or deliberate in that sense, but I think it's something that organically happens if a priest seeks a life which is close to the people of God.
So now here's a harder question. This is not a Catholic podcast, and there's going to be a lot of non-Catholic, leftist, anti-fascist listeners who might have negative views of the church, given the status of women within it, teachings on reproductive rights, policies around queerness, the handling of clerical abuse. So to the extent that your vocation relates you to these views and this institution, what would you say to the non-Catholic listener who is wondering what they have in common with you, in the fight against ICE, for example, or, if any of these issues are a barrier for listening to what you have to say?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would say the church offers a critique of capitalism that I find very powerful. Of course, I think all of this is related to the person of Jesus Christ. Like the church, to the degree that it's doing what it should be doing, is going back to the person of Jesus Christ. And what do we see in the person of Jesus Christ? But an anti-imperial critique, a critique of the domination of politics, a certain idea about servant leadership as opposed to dominant leadership, also obediential leadership, that leaders in the political community, to the degree that they're doing what they should be doing, should be listening and obeying the masses of the people in the political body. Also a critique of economics. Of course, Jesus is very famous for his critique of wealth, right, saying that it's more likely for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to inherit the reign of God. And then in Jesus' first major speech, what does he say? He says, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the reign of God." Now, I think oftentimes that the idea of the kingdom or reign of God has been so disaffiliated from life on earth, when actually this is precisely what Jesus Christ was all about in the Our Father. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So when Jesus is saying that radical line, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the reign of God," Jesus is offering an alternative society that not only applies to the heavenly realm. I certainly do believe in the afterlife, and I believe that there'll be radical changes in social life that will occur in the afterlife. But Jesus is not merely speaking about that, but also about the present. And then he followed that up with, in Luke's gospel, these series of woes. Woe to you who are rich. Woe to you who are not hungry. You've had your fill. And so we see this radical egalitarianism that is part of Jesus' message. And also, Jesus was critical of religious authorities of his day as well. And I think the church also, when it's at its best, preserves some of that skepticism to some degree about religious authority, because Jesus showed the way. He said that the way to lead is not as the Gentiles lead. And when he says that, he means the Roman Empire.
Right.
That's not the way that we do leadership, but leadership is through service. So I think that lay people also in the church, should encourage their pastors to be servant leaders and to be listening people. And this is something that Pope Francis and Pope Leo have been encouraging a lot. They have this idea that they call synodality. Synodality is the idea that the church walks together. It's not like the priest is in a radically hierarchical relationship with the rest of the people of God, but rather the priest has an obediential authority of service. So I think in all of those ways, also, I'd have to say, I think the church has offered, especially in recent times, a radical critique of the climate catastrophe.
Right.
You saw this in Pope Francis with the document Laudato Si, where he criticizes this relationship between capitalism, which is premised on the idea of endless growth. But we know that that does not equate very well with our earth and its limited resources, and also the affiliation that we see between increases in productivity and growth in capitalism, and also carbon emissions and the destruction of the environment. So I think this goes back to the simple idea, which is that all of creation is good. The human body is good. Everything about the material world is good. And so when we do harm to the material world and to the ecosystem, in a way, we're disrespecting the creation of God. And so I think the Catholic Church offers a critique there. So I think that the Catholic Church, in many ways, can be a partner with people who are anti-fascist, because we share many of the common goals with each other, which have to do with equality, which have to do with a different way of relating to our environment. And I believe that wherever there is conflict in society, conflict is also reproduced in the church. And so there's a few different ways that I think people on the left can approach the church. One way would be to totally dismiss the church, which in a way cedes the church to the right. and the church becomes a Christo-fascist space. Or you could say, well, I'm going to like not relate, or maybe even go against, what the church is saying. But what I've been promoting, and what I think liberation theology promotes, is kind of an idea of looking at what are the places where the church and people on the left can collaborate together on common projects. And certainly one of them these days has been the struggle of migrants, and I've been a little bit part of that movement in the defense of migrants here in Chicago who are being wrongfully detained also on colonized land. So I think we need to also see how the Catholic Church can be a partner to people on the left, and I think in many ways today we're seeing that.
That is a lot, Father David, and it gets us right into liberation theology. But to really make this sort of practical for listeners, I think if, let's say that you and I show up and we are active at the same ICE protest, and I am, sort of Catholic sympathetic, but I have strong disagreements with some of the sort of social teachings around the church, but I know that you represent them, but you might not have them front of mind. That might not be why you're there. After all, it's not like an anti-abortion protest. It's actually a protest against ICE. I think that the real sort of practical question is like, does that come between us? And if that comes between us, do I no longer cooperate with you? And does the more rightward-leaning Catholic begin to take over that space? I think that seems to be the crucial practical question.
Yeah. Well, I think that there is certainly a tendency that we see all around, which is this question of ideological purity, which is that unless you and I agree on every issue, then we're not going to be able to collaborate with each other. But I don't think that this is really a strong way of proceeding in terms of building power and building solidarity and building a movement, right? Because, in fact, people are radically diverse in their backgrounds, in their beliefs on politics and religion. And so I think that as opposed to finding ways for us to exclude each other, we should find ways to include each other in common struggles. And so I think that's probably a better way of approaching coalition building, is there are differences, but where can we find common ground in order to strategize together? And I also think on the main issues of our day, which for me would be the struggle against capitalism and the struggle against climate change, the Catholic Church and people who are on the left have a large amount of common ground.
Right.
And so I think that we should build up power together. This is actually one of the things that is, I think, unique and important to highlight about the Latin American church. Because the Latin American church, in so many ways, has shown that liberative movements and the Catholic Church can go together, whether it's Miguel Hidalgo in the independence of Mexico from colonial powers in Europe, whether it's the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, who said that they were going to propose a humanist socialism that's also Christian. And so we've seen kind of throughout the history of Latin America that in radical ways, the church and revolutionary movements can come together to promote the common good. And I think that the U.S. church can learn from that from both sides. What does the Catholic Church have to learn and grow into to be a better partner to liberation movements, and how also can liberation movements not be exclusionary of Catholics and Christians and people of other religions as well, who are more than happy to join forces.
Okay, getting right down to how all of your background and your facility with and love for liberation theology brings you to the present moment. Why has it been important for you to participate in these efforts to bring the Eucharist to detainees in that Chicago ICE facility?
Yes. So as the Coalition for Spiritual and Public Leadership, we've articulated 3 goals that we're seeking as we're attempting to bring communion to detainees in Broadview. The first one would be simply, we do believe in the fundamental human right for people to freely exercise their religion. And communion is, for Catholics, the source and summit of our faith. It's so integral to who we are. And it brings comfort, it brings strength and solidarity, and it unites us as one body. And so I would say for those who are detained, that simple act of communion, as actually folks have been reminding me in our movement of, it's really showing the solidarity and the humanity of the people who are detained in that facility. It's highlighting that humanity and connectedness, which brings unity in the church. So that's one, for the sake of the detainees and their fundamental right to the free exercise of religion. But then the other parts of it would be that we know that we're living in an era in which the meaning of Christianity is very contested. And it always has been contested, but I think we're seeing it in a particular way in this moment.
Right.
And what we want to show is that the Catholic Church is not going to be silent in the face of the oppression of our migrant sisters and brothers. And so it's also a public witness, where the Church is giving witness for really the whole country and also for the Trump administration to see that we're not going to allow this to happen without resisting. And one of the first steps in resistance is to do it in a peaceful and humble manner. And what we have seen is that that has not worked, in fact, in these cases, which
Right.
demonstrates that potentially we should consider the next step, which is civil disobedience. But what it does demonstrate is that we have tried. And I think the public has seen this, the great act of humility that occurred in this moment when my brother priests and sisters and lay people very humbly communicated with the Illinois State Police, who relayed the message to ICE, and ICE says no. And then humbly they turn around and enter into a moment of song and prayer. And seeing that humility also speaks volumes to the general public, that is something that has been tried and has not been listened to.
So there's something strategic about the performance of this first attempt and what it displays. Like, you are showing the public, look at, so the basis for us wanting to come to these detainees is the basis of religious freedom and nurturance, and we are being turned away. Obviously, we are not a danger to the state, right? Obviously, we're not a danger to the facility. The strategy is in showing the public that a very reasonable and actually generous appeal is being turned away.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I wish that they would have let us in.
Right. That's not your intention.
Yes,
but now,
that's the primary intention.
Right.
Is
Right.
that I wish that they would have let us in. And in fact, some people, especially those who are more on the Catholic right, have said that we're using the Eucharist as a political football.
Yes.
I don't think that this is the case. Actually, the Catholic Church, all throughout the world, every day, offers communion to detainees and to those who are imprisoned. And what was rendered political in this moment was actually the rejection. You know, if ICE would have simply let us into the facility to do what the Catholic Church does every day, then this would have not been a particularly political moment. But they made the decision to deny that right. And what it does is it also reveals, then the public asks the question, and certainly like, why? Why are they being denied this right? And we know that the answer is, and it amplifies this, that those who are inside that facility are being treated in such horrible, inhumane conditions that even the simple act of allowing like a nun and a priest into that facility to see what is going on inside runs the risk of them giving a first-person account to the public about what they've seen inside. Because right now, the reports that we have about the conditions inside that facility are coming from either people who were detained wrongfully, and then all of them are detained wrongfully, but under the eyes of the administration, you know, they're detained wrongfully, and they're actually U.S. citizens, for example, and then they're released. Or they're people who are deported, and then from maybe Mexico or from Honduras, then they're giving a report about the conditions that are inside. So Senator Dick Durbin, Senator Tammy Duckworth, they're not allowed inside this facility. Really, the only public personality who's been allowed in this facility is Kristi Noem,
Right.
whose opinion, of course, we don't trust at all. And we've seen her the images of her posing in front of detainees treated in horrible conditions in El Salvador. So why would we expect anything different to be happening in the suburbs of Chicago? Then the last, I think, reason that we're doing what we're doing is because we want to bring strength and solidarity to ourselves. I think we call upon grace. This is a moment of prayer, and we need strength in order to persevere in this struggle. And I don't know about you, but I can't do this alone. I mean, this is a spiritual struggle, and it's a struggle in our hearts as well. Like, can I muster enough courage in order to resist? And that's where I call upon God, but also we are strengthened by gathering together. Like when you see 2,000 fellow Catholics outside of this facility singing and praying together, you say, I'm not alone in this struggle, and it gives me the courage to maybe even take the next more radical steps that we need to do to resist.
It's not only 2,000 Catholics singing and praying, but they're singing and praying, words and phrases and maybe melodies that are maybe 1,000 years old. Like it's also a weight of moral history and culture.
That's absolutely right. And so like even something as simple as the penitential act where we say, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy. In Greek, Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, Kyrie eleison. What we're saying is to God, look upon us with mercy, because what is happening here at this location? People are being put into a prison camp on the outskirts of Chicago, and we're seeing these masked ICE agents come through in their SUVs. We're seeing detainees arrive on buses right before our eyes, and we're saying, Lord, have mercy on this horrible situation and give us the strength of your Spirit to resist it. So we're attaching these like deep, as you say, religious symbols and words to a very real, concrete struggle.
But they can also be enlarged and enriched, because I have to say this is the first moment that I have heard the Kyrie as a kind of collective we, like Lord have mercy on us. Usually I remember reciting that as a personal reflection on my imperfections or my own sins, but you're saying that actually maybe this is a liberation theology lens as well. You're saying that actually it's a prayer for some sort of grace to change a social situation, a collective situation.
That's right, yeah. No, in liberation theology and also in the broader Catholic social teaching, we speak about social sin. And I think that it's important to talk about social sin because actually this problem of the United States treating migrants with inhumanity extends beyond, sadly, but very really, extends beyond the Trump administration. The Trump administration is doing these attacks against the migrant community in a particularly horrific and inhumane way and on a massive scale. And they're also publicizing and sensationalizing it in a particular way. But of course we know that Biden and Obama and Bush and generations of U.S. officials have been persecuting migrants. And also, again, and I'll repeat it, I think it's important to repeat, would be many migrants who have roots in indigenous communities in the United States. So
right.
It's a colonial power that's imposing this authority on many people who come from a mestizaje background. So there's so many layers of cruelty that are happening here. And it's happening in the context of a social sin, a structural sin that actually goes way back in history to the times of colonization. And there's a thread that runs from that to the present moment. So we're saying, like, God, have mercy on us for all of that and inspire us to change. Because, like, when you make a good act of contrition as a Catholic, you acknowledge the wrongdoing, but you also promise to, like, not do it again, like to resist the temptation in the future.
This is blowing my mind because not only is it a plural statement now, but you're also suggesting that if you, David Inczauskis, show up at the ICE facility as a white guy and you are bringing communion to Latin Americans who are wrongfully detained, that you are also saying, Lord, have mercy for my participation or my complicity in a colonial structure.
I think that's exactly right. And the degree to which I can be a Chicagoan and live on this land, I think there's already a question there. But the degree to which it makes sense at all for that to be interpreted in an ethical way would be if I am acting as an ally to the most oppressed people in this context, because otherwise, it's a reproduction of the colonial structure. So I think that's part of what liberation theology is doing, is it's offering a critique of sin in the context of that which kills life, and impedes human flourishing in a social sense. Because sometimes we think of sin, exactly as you're saying, as this very individualistic enterprise. And it's all about, a personal sense of guilt. And I think, we don't want to go to the extreme position of saying, like, I have no individual agency and,
right.
I'm just wildly dependent on social structures. No, we do have the capacity as human beings. We have a relative amount of liberty to be able to resist. But what liberation theology does is it places a particular emphasis on structures and systems of oppression that have existed in history, and the job of the Catholic Church to ally itself with movements that are going to bring about a liberated state of humanity so that we can move from the realm of necessity into the realm of freedom for all.
This distinction between the individualistic perspective and almost like a psycho-spiritual perspective on things like confession. Like, for instance, I think my views on the individualized nature of sin, I don't think I heard the concept of social sin when I was a child growing up. It's not like I wasn't influenced by liberation theology at all, but my understanding of sin was really sort of encapsulated by, well, when you go to confession, you kneel down and you spill out your own particular your own misgivings, your own failures. And I think that was the model that I had. And so I'm wondering whether or not in liberation theology there is a notion of a kind of collective confession that you are engaging in.
Yeah, I think that moment of the Kyrie is doing exactly that. But also I think it's, I was ordained a few months ago, and I've had the opportunity to do some confessions.
Right.
And there are people who confess sins like racism. And when I hear that, part of me, you feel the horror of that, but also there's part of me that rejoices because there's
right.
also the sense that, people do understand that, because, sadly, for, maybe a lot of people, what they see sin as about, sexuality. And that's
right. That's
how
the framework
sin is interpreted.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And so most of your confession points are going to be related to those very private, personal matters, and not much more.
That is often the case, but I think that what we want to do as liberation theologians is to resist that and place it in a broader context.
Right.
And so I do think it's an important thing to reflect on, for those who are Catholics who may be listening, but think, how am I as an individual participating in these broader structures of social sin? And what is the kind of reckoning that I need to do? Maybe it's certainly a part of it is in conversation with others, but another part of it is in conversation with God, to ask for the grace to be transformed and to move from a Christian who is caught up in these systems of oppression towards a Christian who is making a dedicated commitment to pursuing liberation, which implies great risk, but also this is what we see in Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ, who hangs from the cross,
right,
is not in that position because he went with the flow. He's there because he resisted.
Yeah.
and that runs a risk. But you see, this is a beautiful life, is the life of resistance for the sake of justice. And that's the life of Jesus Christ that is at the heart of our faith. And so how can we call ourselves Christians without following that radical path of solidarity and community, which means resisting oppression, political, religious, and economic, and in many other ways too.
So you speak of risk. Earlier you said, we've shown the public that trying to bring Eucharist to the ICE facility has been turned away. We've shown our intentions there. We might have to move to an escalation of civil disobedience. And I think this brings us to a common objection to liberation theology, which is, and this is historical, this goes, back over decades, but it can be said that through your simple historical observation that a certain amount of force, or even, now you're not saying this, but other liberation theologians have, including Gutierrez, that historically violence often erupts in liberation struggles. The implication is made that somehow liberation theology endorses or encourages force or violence. Like that was Cardinal Ratzinger's implication back in 1986. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yes. Well, I would say prima facie, I would be against violence, but there are some situations in which a violent revolutionary movement makes sense and is actually in coherence with Catholic social teaching and with something that many popes actually in documents of Catholic social teaching have confirmed, which is that if there's a particularly extreme case of repression and oppression in civil society, that Catholic social teaching allows for there to be a violent revolutionary movement. Now, the word violence is a very loaded word. Maybe we could see it in another way of saying it would be kind of resistance to oppression.
Right.
Or another way of seeing it would be communal self-defense, right? So I do think that maybe Cardinal Ratzinger, in these broad, sweeping ideas about the condemnation of violence and the associating of liberation theology with violence, stands actually out from a larger and long-standing tradition in the Catholic Church, which says that there are situations in which just war is permitted. Now, the just war theories have been used in order to justify many of history's greatest oppressions.
Right.
However, the just war theory also makes sense in the sense that part of what just war theory says is that the response, if someone is going to engage in violent actions, these actions have to be because peaceful methods were tried.
Yes, right.
Because there's greater harm that will come from not resisting than from resisting. And also it gives you a scope, because Catholic social teaching in the just war theory does say, yes, violence is justified in some, extreme revolutionary situations, but that doesn't give someone the opportunity to use violence in any way. It's to be used in a strategic and controlled way, such that it's not producing a greater harm than the one that's being done, by the initial act of oppression. So I think all of these things considered, a just war theory that combines with a liberation theology perspective makes total sense. And there are situations when that violent reaction against oppression is justified. And I think that we have, it's kind of crazy, because as people in the United States of America, we have these histories of the American Revolution, we have the history of the Civil War.
Right.
Which, both of these in incomplete ways, but in ways that are probably better than their alternative of doing nothing, are justified acts of violence.
Right.
And yet, some people say, well, today there's no circumstance in which that makes sense, but I think that the way that I'm approaching this would be, yes, we should try all possible peaceful and legal means. If that doesn't work, civil disobedience, if that doesn't work, then we may have to consider even more radical actions. Now, I don't think that we're there in this moment, and I think that taking, violent measures in this particular context at this point is not the way of proceeding. But I think I could imagine a scenario, especially given what we're looking at in the near future with climate change and the extreme notions of fascism and capitalism, which are emerging all around the world, for me to say that there's no violent resistance that's imaginable doesn't fit with the history even of the Catholic Church, and doesn't fit surely with Catholic social teaching, just war theory, and with a more radical interpretation of that theory that comes from liberation theology.
Well, given that larger church background and perspective, we have Pope Leo now giving liberation theology directions, basically, from Rome with his full chest, with Dilexite, and then some recent comments as well that are directly pointed at Trumpian immigration theory or policy. And as he invokes liberation theology, he's not even warning about it anymore. Like he's, in 1986, Cardinal Ratzinger's letter was really about, there are certain principles of Marxist theory that liberation theologians have accepted into their theology without due consideration, or it's been reckless or something like that. But there's not even a warning about the power or his citation of liberation theology comes with no caveats. He even kind of minimizes the prior objections. And so I'm wondering what impact you think that will have on, the world's Catholics, especially as they respond to the issues that you're talking about.
Yes. Well, I think Pope Leo is continuing in this tradition of Pope Francis, and Pope Francis very strongly united the critique of climate change with the critique of capitalism. And we're seeing that, and it's so clear. It's so clear that not some components of Marxist theory are bearing themselves out in the reality of the present moment. As Marx is criticizing and is highlighting the different contradictions of capitalism. And we're seeing many of those, maybe some of those contradictions took longer to come to the fore than Marx would have imagined. But I think in particular in the climate crisis, we're seeing one of these contradictions in capitalism, which is, this endless theory of growth and the desire to maximize profit margins. And capitalism always needs to grow and expand, and it's running up against a very physical limit. And so this is something that Marx and especially, eco-Marxists have been pointing out for quite a long time. And we're seeing that Pope Francis in Laudato Si and also Pope Leo in this very document are criticizing precisely this. Laissez-faire capitalism, this idea that the invisible hand is going to work everything out and guide us to prosperity, when instead what we're seeing is that this invisible hand is causing chaos all around the world and mass migration as people, as the climate is changing. I went to Honduras a few years ago and had a series of interviews with farm workers who are talking about how they can simply no longer use the land that they've been working on for hundreds of years. Because of climate change, and so they feel forced to either set up these shanty towns all throughout Latin America that are on the outskirts of major Latin American cities. That's one option, because they can no longer farm their land, or come to the United States and attempt that treacherous journey. So all of these things are linked. As Pope Francis said, everything is connected. And this is something that Marxists have been pointing out with their systematic structural interpretation of economic life for a long time. Now, does that mean that I accept Marx's atheism and Marx's materialism? Absolutely not.
Right.
So the very components of Marxism that Cardinal Ratzinger, criticized in that sense, like, I agree. I believe that there are spiritual realities, and I believe in God. So on that point, I disagree with Marx. But many of Marx's economic analysis bears out, and as Catholics, we're people that Pope John Paul II, what did he say? Faith and reason go together. And so if reason and the scientific analysis of the economy is leading us to a certain point, then we as Catholics, like, we're not anti-reason people. You know, the Catholic Church has a great intellectual tradition, and we need to be embracing science and reality.
You know, one thing about the intellectual tradition that comes out in an answer like this is that it is dialectical, but it is also a soft dialectical, a gentle dialectical, because here you are, you know, I'm not going to get you to talk shit about Cardinal Ratzinger, obviously, right? Like, I'm not going to get you, you're not going to criticize these prior teachings, because for you everything flows together. Is that correct? It's like, you know, everything has its place. It's like there is a positive progression, it seems.
Well, I do think that there's parts of the history of the Catholic Church and the thought of the Catholic Church that need to be criticized, and criticized overtly.
Yeah, right.
So I wouldn't want to, you know, just put a stamp on all of Catholic history, because I think that there's and Catholic thought, because there are things that don't go. You know, we have the famous syllabus of errors, which condemns democracy and the freedom of religion. So obviously I don't, you know, agree with this particular version of the 19th century iteration of what papal teaching is.
Right.
But I would say there is a broader coherence in the sense that the Catholic Church is an institution that is about tradition. And what tradition, actually, none of us can avoid tradition. I don't think that, like Jean-Paul Sartre, we can just create ourselves out of nothing. You know, all of us exist in traditions, and the most obvious one is that all of us speak a language that we inherited or learned from other people. So we do exist in traditions, but traditions are not static. Traditions are dynamic, and so there's different iterations that the Catholic Church has made throughout history that need to be corrected, that need to grow and change. And this is something that Cardinal Newman, who actually Pope Leo the 14th just made a doctor of the Church, he talked about, you know, if you don't grow, you're dead.
Right.
This is part of life, is growing and changing. Like, the moment that you stop doing that as an organic body, like, you die, and and you are changed as opposed to changing. So I would say yes. Like, I think there's such a richness in the Catholic tradition, and this is what you know. I wrote the document that I wrote that allows me to be a seminary professor, and that was approved by the Institutional Catholic Church, is a document that talks about the roots of liberation theology in the early Church, where the early Church fathers are criticizing the wealth of these wealthy Roman landholders who are kind of, they're storing up treasure, not for themselves in heaven, but on earth. And that's going against this basic idea that God created the earth to be shared by all people. So they're criticizing that. They're also criticizing the labor conditions of workers who have to go to extreme lengths in order to acquire luxurious products for wealthy families.
Right.
Well, today we see that all over. You
Right.
know, it's totally unjust for me to say, oh yes, I want to have my iPhone, but having my iPhone is dependent on miners in colonized nations dying in these mines and working under horrible conditions so that we can have these rare earth minerals that are used in our phones. Like that, it's so relevant for today. And actually, like, when we as the Catholic Church connect those dots, we build up a really strong case for how history is pointing us to act in this present moment, in this case, resisting.
So, rounding up, one of the things I hear in your speaking voice, I hear it on your podcast, I hear it right now, is that it sounds like you are smiling almost all of the time. And this might be the good nature of, I don't know, Chicago. It might be personality. It might be family culture. This might just be your temperament. But I also think, and I wonder, this guy just does not sound like a melancholic or depressive leftist. And so I wanted to ask whether I am hearing the support of faith in your voice, whether I'm hearing the support of tradition in your voice, a feeling that within hard times and amidst, a lot of loss, you are assured of something that is basic and also eternal.
I hope that that's the case. I think that, joy in a way, in the Catholic understanding of joy, is a gift. It's not something that we produce for ourselves. It's very difficult for me to simply say to my heart, be joyful, and then all of a sudden so there's a certain alterity and a mysticism that I think comes along with that, absolutely. But also, I love the point that you just made, because how do we unite joy and struggle? Now, I think there's a very bad way to unite joy and struggle, which was evidenced in the most recent presidential campaign,
right,
where the joy is communicating actually a great ignorance about the suffering of people, because people are suffering in so many ways in the United States and all throughout the world. And so to be joyful in the face of that suffering makes no sense, and it's so false. And it's not authentic at all. It's a made-up joy, right? Now, the flip side of that is to be only angry and only sad, and to build a movement only around that. And I think that there is a great risk in that too, because what we need to do is project a future which is different, in which people are able to cohere and respect each other's differences, but also have their basic needs taken care of. And we also have to attract people.
Right.
And I think this is a key component for any community organizing and political organizing, is to build up a community. People need to feel energized and motivated. And they feel energized and motivated because they have a vision of change that gets them excited. So if all of our commentary is negative, critical, then we're not going to be able to build up a movement. And I think this is part of what we've seen in a small but significant way in the New York mayor's race.
Right.
Zoran is a joyful guy, generally.
Right.
He's smiling in these debates. I don't see it as a falsity. In some ways, he's smiling at the irony of the horror of his opponents and the people that he's running against, and sees the tragic irony of them projecting themselves as candidates to run the biggest city in the United States of America. Part of it comes from that. But part of it is he has proposed a vision in these concrete economic changes that people get excited about. And I think, as Catholics but also as people who are committed to revolutionary and liberationist change, that's precisely what we have to do. We have to have a project. And this is where anti-fascism is so correct. We need to resist fascism, but it's only part of the story. Because the other part of the story is we're not merely, anti-fascism, but we're also promoting a different version of reality. What Paul Ricoeur, what liberation theologians have called utopia. It's projecting something that doesn't exist, but it's concrete. It's a real project. It's not a utopia about, some fantastic distant future. It's a utopia that, yes, it's something that doesn't exist currently, but it's something that could be won through struggle. And part of that is communicating a joyful message that gets people excited about that change. And that's what gets people out, on the streets and eager to work.
Father David, thank you so much for your time. I just wanted one last question. Is Rome sending you Kevlar for your upcoming events? Are you getting helmets that will match the stole color? Are you being offered protection?
There we go. So far, so good, right? I've not been, punched in the face or hit with bullets. That day may come, but, so far, so good. So I think that for the time being, we'll just put on the armor of Christ, and we'll see if that needs to be adjusted in the near future.
Thank you, Father. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thanks for having me.